Do you struggle with workplace relationships? Do you find yourself scratching your head and wondering, what did they just do? Or what did I just do? Then this video is exactly for you. Because today we're going to answer the question, what can I do to improve my workplace relationships? Today we're going to explore why is it it's so difficult to trust some people? Why is it some people like to micromanage others? Why is it that some people like to work alone and others in teams? And we're going to look at a theory of attachment, which is a way of looking at things perhaps that you have never considered before, but I promise you if you stay tuned that you will learn wonderful insights about other people's behavior and maybe even your own. Stay tuned as well because at the end of this video, I'm going to provide you information on a course that I have specifically developed around attachment theory and a way of better understanding how you show up in the important relationships in your life. We know from research that many of the issues that we have as adults actually begin in childhood. And one of the ways that perhaps will give us insight into some of our behaviors, especially as we show up at work, is from a theory called attachment theory. Now, this theory was developed by two English psychologists, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. And here's what they tried to look at. They researched how infants responded to their caregiver. And what they found was something fascinating. They found that how we experienced our caregiver as a child influenced the way that we developed our relationships with other people and influenced some of our behaviors. So today we're going to explore some of their findings and how attachment can really influence how we show up today. When we were a child, we had many different needs. Sometimes we were scared, sometimes we were hungry, sometimes we were in need of love and affection. And our primary caregiver responded to those needs in different ways. And what Ainsworth and Bowlby discovered is that there were three main ways that caregivers responded and how that imprinted in us a way that we continue today to respond in our relationships. The first was secure. If as a child we had our needs met by our primary caregiver, if we could trust that when we had needs that they would be responded to by our primary caregiver, then we tend today to form secure relationships. It's about 56% of the population. If as a child, however, sometimes those needs were inconsistently met, sometimes our caregiver showed up, but at other times they did not, then we tend to form an anxious attachment to other people. That makes up about 20% of the population. And then the third type is if as a child our caregiver ignored or really wasn't present to us for those needs that we had, what happens is that we tend to form an avoidant relationship style. And that makes up about 26% of the population. So let's go through each of those three attachment styles and explore how you might be able to observe them both in yourself or in others at work. The first is the secure attachment style. Now, people who have a secure attachment style normally are able to form healthy relationships throughout their lives. Doesn't mean that they are perfect people, but what it means is that they're able to navigate the ups and the downs of relationships. They know that it's important for relationships to have boundaries, and they are very good in creating the boundaries around their relationships. They are able to balance both closeness and distance. They realize that in a relationship, there are times when intimacy is important, and also there are times when it's important to give people a little bit of a distance in that particular moment. So in the workplace, what you'll see is people who are able to establish trusting relationships, people who are able to give support to other people and the right amount of support. Sometimes they're able to realize that a person needs more support, but at other times they need a little bit of distance, and they're able to accommodate that person depending on their needs. They're able to be supportive of other people in the workplace, and as well, they're able to deal with conflict, and they're able to bring down the level of conflict in the workplace. Very often what you'll notice with people with secure attachment styles, that they are not the cause of much of the conflict, and they're not the cause of many of the people problems at work. The second attachment style is the anxious attachment style. Now, just from the way that it is called, what you begin to see is that this person has a lot of anxiety about relationships in their life. What happens, of course, is that as a child, their caregiver was very inconsistent. And so what happened is there was a constant need to make sure that the caregiver was there. So as an adult, what happens in a relationship, the anxious attachment style is constantly looking for comfort and care, constantly looking that they will not be abandoned by the other person. They want that support. And so what happens very often with this attachment style is there's a lot of second guessing. Now, in the workplace, how this shows up in two ways that can be very interesting. First of all is the tendency towards a negative bias. And what we mean by this is they're always thinking that something wrong is going to happen. They always interpret things as something negative is about to happen. So say, for example, an email comes, it's from the boss, and very often a person with an anxious attachment style won't even open it. They'll ruminate about the email. They'll think about it. They'll think about, oh, this is bad news. There's something going on here. Why haven't I been told? The second thing is time management becomes very difficult for an anxious attachment style at work, because very often these people have difficulty saying no. They want approval. They seek approval from others. And so very often what they find themselves is saying yes to everything and over-functioning. Of course, there are prime cases for burnout because that yes will have an impact. So if you see that in yourself or you see that in others, very often what you've got to understand is that these things elicit within you a fight or flight approach, that you can become anxious or worried. And so it's really important to integrate some exercises that help you slow down, that help you recognize what's happening, and choose exercises perhaps that help you choose different approaches. So instead of always thinking negatively, or instead of always saying yes to something, to begin perhaps to choose a more thoughtful response. So before we move on to the third style, I'm really curious about if some of this material is resonating with you. Do you see yourself in any of these styles? Do you see other people at work in these styles? Because I think what's really interesting is attachment theory can truly help us understand some of our own behaviors and understand other people's behaviors as well. So if you do, please make some comments below and let me know, what are you experiencing and what are you seeing at work? The third attachment style is avoidant attachment style. Now, as a child, this person had to fend for themselves. And so very often what happened is that they became self-sufficient. They learned how to work alone. They learned to be independent. So how does that show up in work? Well, it shows up in the continuation of that independence. Very often the avoidant attachment style are people who are very comfortable and in fact would prefer to do things by themselves. They find it hard to trust others because they are so self-dependent, and very often they're very confident in their own skills and their own abilities, and therefore they prefer to do things by themselves. They find teamwork a little more difficult because that means trusting and also giving up some of that independence. Now, how that shows up in the world of work can be very interesting as well, because very often the avoidant attachment style likes to do things by themselves. They want to be left alone. And when they get a manager perhaps who is anxious and wants to oversee things, who wants to micromanage, then what happens is that the avoidant will want to push back even more because they don't like the closeness of that relationship or the micromanaging, and therefore that frustrates the boss even more. And so a vicious circle is created. Now, What's important as a learning pattern for avoidant attachment styles is the recognition that they cannot do everything by themselves. And so to implement perhaps some form of curiosity, to realize that there are certain areas where teamwork is required and where trusting is required. That can be very difficult for an avoidant person who really doesn't trust because history has taught them that they need to depend on themselves. But that's part of the learning pattern for an avoidant person. I remember when I first looked at attachment theory and I saw its connection with the world of work, it was almost as if I had new insights into the behavior of people. I hope you've enjoyed this video and the 3 styles and how they can influence all the different patterns that are happening in the world of work. If you've enjoyed the content and would like perhaps to explore it in a greater depth, we've just created a new course which is called Why I Suck at Relationships, and it explores this attachment theory and how it influences us. Now, what's important about attachment theory is that it's not fixed, that we can move from one attachment pattern to another. And the course explores how we can integrate behaviors in our lives that can help us be more successful. So if you're interested in the course, please see the link below. There's also a special discount coupon that you can use when you're purchasing the course. And if you've enjoyed the video today and you'd like to see some more content, then I invite you to watch the next video, which looks about how can I establish trust in the workplace.